Hello and welcome back to the Crime Reel. For today's video we take a look at 5 cold cases and the stories of those involved who battle for years and often decades before finally bringing the perpetrators to justice. Whilst the length of time to solve these cases is always heartbreaking, a killer gets on with their life, living their best years, whilst their victims and families have no ability to do the same. But ultimately, there is something incredibly satisfying about those who believe that they had got away with murder finally getting their comeuppance. So on to today's first case, which took place way back in 1957. On Monday, the 22nd of July, 4 teenagers aged between 15 and 17 had made the journey to a so-called Lover's Lane in Hawthorne, California, and were hanging out in their 1949 Ford sedan. A fairly well-dressed, 6-foot-tall, blonde-haired man approached the car and pulled out a gun, saying, "Don't get scared, I'm only going to take your money." He lied. The man forced the teenagers to undress and then bound and blindfolded them with strips of their own clothing. Brandishing the gun, he forced the 2 boys and one of the girls into the back seat of the vehicle. He then sexually assaulted the other girl. Once finished, the man made all 4 of them walk in front of the car, threatening to run them down on multiple occasions. Deciding that their ordeal was over, the man then sped off in the teenagers' car, leaving them naked and stranded. As he fled the scene, he jumped a red light on Rosecrans Avenue near Palm Avenue in Manhattan Beach. This traffic violation was witnessed by 2 police officers, 28-year-old Officer Richard Phillips and Officer Milton Curtis, who was 25, of the El Segundo Police Department. They sprung into action and pulled the man over. Officer Richard Phillips got out of the patrol car to write a ticket, whilst Officer Milton Curtis remained in the car. At 1:20 a.m, they radioed through to see if the car was on the wanted list. It wasn't. At 1:25 a.m, so just 5 minutes later, the teenagers would report that their car had been stolen. If the officers had radioed through just a few minutes later, they may have been given some warning that they were dealing with something more than a routine traffic violation. As the ticket was being issued, 2 other patrolmen drove past, but nothing was amiss. 2 minutes later, these patrolmen would hear Officer Richard Phillips on the police radio weakly saying, "Send ambulance," and they then raced back to the scene. By the time the patrolmen arrived, both officers were already dead. Officer Milton Curtis was still in the police car and had been shot 3 times. His partner, Officer Richard Phillips, was on the ground having been shot 3 times in the back. In his dying moments, he had managed to return fire on the blonde man who was driving away before putting out a desperate call for help on the police radio. Officer Richard Phillips had served in the Air Force during the Korean War and left behind his wife Carol and 3 young children, 4-year-old Carolyn, Patricia who was 3, and Richard Jr. who was just 20 months old. His fellow partner, Officer Milton Curtis, left 2 young children, Keith, who was 5, and 2-year-old Tony, and his wife, Jean. By now, the teenagers had given the authorities a description of the perpetrator and also the getaway car, and within minutes of the shooting, the search was underway. The Ford sedan was found about 4 blocks away from the murder scene. There were 3 bullet holes in the vehicle, and it was clear that the perpetrator had been shot. As the hours passed, an artist's impression of the blonde man was released, and a report came in from Camille Wilson, who lived at 734 33rd Street, which was less than a mile from the scene of the shooting. Camille said that a man who fit the description of the shooter had knocked at her door asking if she could be a good Samaritan and get him a glass of water. He was bleeding and claimed to have been in a car accident. An area of approximately a square mile of Manhattan Beach was sealed off by more than 100 heavily armed officers in an attempt to find this man. The area was searched, cars were checked going in or out of the location, but that man had disappeared without a trace. 2 days later, on the 24th of July 1957, William Allen, a dark-haired man from San Francisco, admitted killing the 2 police officers. During the interview, he told a rambling story of shooting them in order to scare them. It was established that he had escaped from a mental health facility in Illinois and had no involvement in the shootings. Evidence was scarce and progress was slow. Several people were arrested in connection with the crime, but gradually they were all cleared from having any involvement. Time passed and the story faded from the headlines. It would be almost 3 years before the murder weapon was recovered. In March 1960, Douglas Tully, who lived at 555 33rd Street, Manhattan Beach, reported to the police that he had found the cylinder of a .22 revolver in the garden at his home. He told them that he had also found a pistol, minus a cylinder, a year earlier, together with a man's wristwatch, medallion and crucifix. However, he had not connected these to the earlier shooting 5 blocks away. It was established that the jewellery belonged to the teenagers who had been attacked that night, and the gun was the one used to kill the officers, Richard Phillips and Milton Curtis. Using the serial number of the weapon, the police discovered that it was purchased at a Sears store in Shreveport, Louisiana, on the 16th of June 1957 by a man by the name of George D. Wilson, who it was then established had been staying at a nearby YMCA at the time. With what felt like a solid lead in tracing the murderer of their colleagues, the El Segundo team painstakingly tracked down every George D. Wilson in the United States. Every single one was ruled out. The name was deemed to be an alias, and the case once again went cold. And that is how it would remain for over 4 decades. The next major development wouldn't take place until 2002, when the systems for computerizing fingerprint technology advanced and fingerprint data from arrests across all 50 states was coordinated. Finally, there was a match. A partial left thumbprint that was lifted from the steering wheel of the teenager's stolen car directed the authorities to a man who had been convicted of a burglary in Columbia, South Carolina, in 1956. Handwriting analysis linked this same man to the one who had purchased the murder weapon in 1957. On the 29th of January 2003, a large group of police officers approached the front door of a house in an affluent suburban neighbourhood of Columbia, South Carolina. The house belonged to 68-year-old Gerald Mason, a wealthy retired grandfather who was described by his neighbours as a pillar of his community, who helped them out, loved to play golf and was a friendly family man. He had been married since September 1960, had 2 daughters, and, since his conviction for burglary in 1956, had never received so much as a parking ticket. Either he had become a law-abiding citizen in the preceding 45 years, or a much more successful criminal. Tellingly, he also had a scar on his back from the bullet fired by Officer Richard Phillips back in 1957. When Gerald came to the door, he was shocked, asking the police what was going on. When it was explained that they were homicide detectives from the El Segundo Police Department and the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department regarding the murders of 2 police officers back in 1957, Gerald replied, "My God, you're here for that? That happened so long ago. I can't believe you are bothering me with that. I think I need a lawyer." It was established that after 23-year-old Gerald was released from prison in South Carolina in 1957, he decided to hitchhike his way to California. Purchasing the gun under an alias in Louisiana, he claimed that this was for protection whilst hitchhiking. He said that he came across the teenagers whilst drunk. When asked why he attacked the group and sexually assaulted the 15-year-old girl, he claimed that he no longer remembered. As he drove away from the teenage group, he was pulled over by the 2 officers and, in an attempt to cover up the sexual assault and theft of the car, shot them both, adding, "I thought, If I don't get them, they're going to get me. So when the officer turned away from me, I shot both officers, got back in the car and drove away. He then dumped the car, escaped through numerous backyards before hitchhiking his way out of the area. At a hearing on the 25th of March 2003, at which none of Gerald's family members were in attendance, he pled guilty to the 2 murder charges. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms with a minimum of 7 years. As part of the deal, the sexual assault, robbery and theft charges were dropped. At his sentencing hearing, Gerald offered a tearful apology to the families of the 2 officers who he gunned down, saying that, "It's impossible to express to so many people how sorry I am. I do not understand why I did this. It does not fit in my life. It is not the person I know. I detest these crimes." However, Keith Curtis, Officer Milton Curtis's son, did not believe the apology, stating that he says he's sorry now, but he hasn't been for the past 46 years. He's only sorry now because he got caught. His mother added that, "I'm not the victim anymore. My son is not the victim anymore. I'm so grateful. It's worth the wait." In a later interview with People magazine, Gerald's daughter, Gerald Mason Whitaker, said that there really aren't words to describe the range of emotions we've gone through, going on to state that nevertheless she could not have had a better father. In 2009, at the age of 75, Gerald was denied parole with the board, deciding that he would not be eligible for further consideration for a period of 15 years. This would make his next parole date March 2024, at which point he would be 90 years old. However, Gerald died in prison on the 22nd of January 2017, which was 9 days before his 83rd birthday. He had lived 45 years as a free man after the murders before serving just 14 years in prison for his crimes. Hello and welcome back to the Crime Reel. For today's true crime narration, we shall be looking at the brutal murder of 78-year-old Mildred Matheny in Florida, and how, over 3 decades later, it looks as though her killer may finally be brought to justice thanks to the advancements in DNA analysis over the years. Out of all the atrocities people commit against their fellow man, the most heinous attacks involve victims with no capacity to defend themselves. Even in a society that tries to protect and advocate for the more vulnerable members of the population, there will always be predators lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect target, one with no hope of fighting back or breaking away. On the night of April the 27th, 1985, 78-year-old Mildred Matheny became one of those unfortunate targets. Mildred was born in Wilmer, Arkansas on February the 28th, 1907. She was the second oldest of Jesse and Margaret Warren's 6 children. In 1915, when Mildred was just 8 years old, her father had a heart attack and passed away at the age of just 37. His widow, Margaret, was left to raise their 6 young children on her own. As an adult, Mildred spent over 40 years working as a psychiatric nurse. She married a man by the name of Guy Harmon Matheny, and they had 1 child together, a boy who they named Gary. Gary would later go on to have children of his own, making Mildred a grandmother. Mildred was widowed at the age of 51 when her husband Guy passed away in 1958. Shortly afterwards, Mildred began caring for her brother, whose mental health had begun to decline. By the time Mildred was in her 70s, she was struggling with her own health, having been diagnosed with dementia. As her condition deteriorated, she needed more and more help with daily tasks, and eventually it got to the point where she was no longer able to live on her own. It was decided that Mildred would move from her home in Arkansas to live with her sister, Gladys, in Lake Worth, Florida. Similar to many dementia patients, Mildred had a tendency to wander off. She would become confused and lost in everyday situations, and often talked of going out to visit her parents, who had both died decades earlier. Because of this, she rarely went outside without someone to accompany her. However, it is near impossible to keep an eye on somebody around the clock, and on the 27th of April 1985, Mildred Matheny managed to leave the house by herself. Her sister Gladys last saw Mildred at around 3:30 p.m. that day. Less than an hour later, Gladys reported that her sister was missing to the Lake Worth Police Department. A young couple, 21-year-old Tina Martin and 28-year-old Robert Steffi, spotted Mildred at the intersection of Dixie Highway and Lucerne Avenue near a Burger King restaurant. Mildred, who was quite a frail, grey-haired woman, was dressed in her pink pyjamas with an orange blouse over the top. Concerned, the couple went to check on Mildred and spent about 15 minutes talking to her before a man parked up beside them. The man was driving a 1967 brown Oldsmobile 2-door Delta 88 Holiday Coupe. He told the young couple that he was one of Mildred's neighbours and offered to give her a ride home. Mildred got into the car and they drove away. 7 hours later, at roughly 10 p.m, Mildred was found unconscious on the side of Old Indiatown Road, a deserted road in Jupiter, Florida, approximately 25 miles from where she lived. Her clothing and dentures were found strewn around her body. She had been sexually assaulted and badly beaten. She was rushed to Martin Memorial Hospital in Stuart, Florida, in a critical condition. 11 days later, at 5:12 p.m, on the 8th of May 1985, Mildred died from her wounds. These injuries included a fractured skull and extensive internal bleeding due to blunt force trauma. The young couple were able to provide a description of the man driving the Oldsmobile. He had long blonde hair and was missing a front tooth. Additionally, the investigators were able to recover a sample of the killer's DNA. However, at that time, the technology required for analysis of such a DNA sample hadn't yet been developed. So with little more than eyewitness accounts to aid investigators, progress on the case was minimal. In May 1985, a Crime Stoppers reconstruction was filmed, but this still didn't get the police any closer to an arrest. The case quickly went cold. Mildred's sister, Gladys, and Mildred's son, Gary, feared that Mildred's killer would never be caught or punished for their crime. And this remained the case for well over 35 years. Until finally, in 2021, a break came in the search for Mildred's murderer. In the March of 2021, a detective from Palm Beach County's Cold Case Unit submitted the DNA sample from Mildred's case to the state database, and it returned a match. A man by the name of Richard Curtis Lang. Richard Lang was born on the 13th of April 1960, and he was no stranger to the criminal justice system. He had been convicted for a number of offences in the past, including 2 counts of aggravated assault and 2 possession of weapons charges. As a result of these possession convictions, he had been required to submit his DNA to Florida's offender registry. At the time of Mildred's murder, Richard was 25 years old and lived in nearby Palm Beach County. This DNA match alone wasn't enough to arrest and ultimately convict him. To confirm that they truly had their man, the police needed a DNA sample directly from the source. A warrant was obtained and Richard was tested at his home in Buffet Key, Boynton Beach. His current address was just 10 minutes away from the spot where Mildred was seen climbing into the so-called neighbour's car all of those years before. The DNA sample was tested and it was a match. Despite Richard totally denying any involvement in her death, the police now had more than enough to place him under arrest for Mildred Matheny's vicious murder. He was booked into the Palm Beach County Jail on April 22nd, 2021 and charged with the kidnapping, sexual assault and first-degree murder of the 78-year-old grandmother. He was taken to the main detention centre at Palm Beach, where he is being held without bail whilst awaiting trial. He continues to maintain his innocence. For people like Mildred's son Gary, who is now an elderly man in his late 80s, the recent advancements in forensic analysis have been a vital component to finding closure after a loved one's case runs cold. When Richard was arrested, Gary spoke of how he had given up hope of ever finding the person responsible. As the years turned to decades, he had less and less faith in the detectives. Despite their unyielding dedication and the promise that they'd get a break in the case eventually, it would have taken nothing short of a miracle, or perhaps a confession, for the investigation to pick up any momentum. And yet, 36 years later, that was exactly what happened, thanks to the efforts of people like Detective John Cogburn of Palm Beach County's Cold Case Unit, who made the decision to revisit the investigation, and also to forensic scientist Tara Sessa, who discovered the DNA match after running the sample through the database. But even though the most pressing question regarding Mildred Matheny's horrific murder may have been answered, one still remains after all this time. Why? What could possibly compel a man in his mid-20s to abduct, assault and kill a 78-year-old woman with dementia? Unfortunately, unless Richard Lang decides to speak about what occurred on April the 27th, 1985, we may never really know whether it was a spur-of-the-moment impulse or part of a carefully calculated plan. But perhaps it doesn't matter. The actions, minds and motives of killers can often be difficult to grasp, if not utterly incomprehensible. After enduring 36 years of heartbreak, wondering who killed his mother, Gary Matheny reportedly admitted that he still struggles to wrap his brain around the circumstances of her death. But now that Mildred's alleged killer is behind bars at last, her son's relief in the interviews that followed was palpable. "That book is closed," he told one reporter shortly after Lang's arrest. "It's really closed." Amazing work there by the Palm Beach County's Cold Case Unit. Please add any comments down below. Thanks for listening to The Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst. The Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office previously had a video about the unsolved case of Mildred Matheny. I'm pleased to say it's been updated now to show it's solved. Goodbye. So just to update the story, I posted this original video back in February the 9th, 2022. Richard Lange was found guilty after a 2-day trial on the 1st of Feb 2023 for the kidnapping, sexual assault and murder of Mildred Matheny. At sentencing later in the year, in July 2023, it was confirmed he will spend the rest of his life in prison. Goodbye. For today's true crime narration, we shall be looking at a case from 1982 which was finally brought to its conclusion in 2022, over 40 years after it took place. David and Brenda Venables were married on the 1st of June 1960. After their marriage, they moved to Quaking House Farm in Bestman's Lane in Kempsey, Worcestershire. On their 500-acre farm, David, with Brenda's assistance, worked as a pig farmer. It was on this farm that the couple lived, seemingly without incident, for 22 years. By 1982, 48-year-old Brenda had some health problems. She had recently recovered from a severe bout of flu and was also suffering with back and leg pain. Over time, this had taken its toll on her mental health and she had become depressed. On the morning of 4th of May 1982, David awoke at around 6:30 a.m. to find that Brenda had disappeared. That afternoon, David went to the Worcester police station to report that his wife was missing. He informed them that he had searched for her since waking up that day and was becoming increasingly concerned for her safety. As soon as the case was registered with them, the police coordinated a search for Brenda. Initially, this concentrated on the couple's home, car, barns and farmland, but with no trace of Brenda to be found, the search area was soon increased. Waterways were checked, door-to-door inquiries conducted, tracker dogs deployed, and a helicopter was brought in to assist with the search around the River Severn. Brenda's description was circulated to all Midlands police forces, whilst David was reported to be waiting anxiously by the telephone for any news of his wife's whereabouts. He was quoted in the Worcester News as saying that he had been unable to sleep a wink since she left, and I can only hope and pray that she is safe. Brenda's bank account remained untouched, and it was speculated that she may have taken her own life. Some surmised that her body may have been washed away in the River Severn, which was only a short distance from the farmhouse where she had lived. Understandably, Brenda's disappearance was big news within the local area, but as the weeks turned into months and then years without a single trace of Brenda being found, her disappearance slowly faded from the minds of all but those who were personally involved. Brenda's parents, who were both in their 80s at the time, were devastated by her disappearance and simply did not believe that she would have taken her own life. The negative impact on their life was immeasurable, both in terms of the emotional devastation of not knowing what had happened to their beloved daughter, but also because Brenda was their main carer, regularly visiting them at their home in Bromsgrove, doing their shopping and assisting with their day-to-day lives. Brenda's father, Harold, died 2.5 years after her disappearance, and her mother, Winifred, died in 1996. Neither of them ever found out what had happened to their daughter. Years passed by and the missing person inquiry remained open, but there were no further developments. Brenda's name was added to her parents' gravestone at St Michael's Church in Rushook. It recorded her year of death as 1982. Despite her body never having been found, this at least allowed her remaining family the small comfort of having a place to remember her. For others, life continued to move forward, and in 2014, 32 years after his wife's disappearance, a now 81-year-old David sold his Quaking House farm to his nephew, Andrew Venables, for around £467,000. David moved to a small bungalow approximately a mile from the farm. It would take another 5 years before there was finally a break in the case. In the summer of 2019, Andrew Venables arranged for the septic tank at the farmhouse to be cleaned. During this routine maintenance, workmen discovered human remains within the tank. The police were contacted on the 12th of July 2019, and by the 16th of July, the discovery was being reported in the local press. It was speculated that the human remains may have been linked to the case of 25-year-old Susie Lamplew, an estate agent who went missing in July 1986 and who has never been found. However, this theory was soon ruled out, and despite the formal identification process taking several more weeks, a spokesman for the investigating detectives stated that whilst they were still waiting for DNA confirmation, general circumstances lead us to believe that the remains are likely to be Brenda Venables. On the 30th of July 2019, David was arrested in connection with the murder of his wife. He denied any involvement in Brenda's disappearance and was released under investigation. Neighbours who were interviewed said they knew little about David, who always kept to himself and would keep the blinds of his home shut at all times. After a lengthy investigation, hindered by the amount of time which had passed since Brenda's disappearance, on the 8th of June 2021, David Venables was charged with his wife's murder. The head of the complex casework unit, Mr. Mark Paul, said that the decision to authorise the charge against the defendant was made after careful consideration of all the available evidence of this complex case and determining that a prosecution is required in the public interest. David's first court appearance on the 15th of June 2021 lasted just 4 minutes. He spoke only to confirm his name, date of birth, address, and that he understood the proceedings. He was remanded into custody for an additional hearing the next day at Birmingham Crown Court. At this hearing, bail was granted on the condition that he would live and sleep at a nominated address, would not apply for a passport, and would not attempt to contact any prosecution witnesses. 89-year-old David's trial started at Worcester Crown Court on the 13th of June 2022, where he continued to maintain his innocence. The prosecution went on to state that David had known that Brenda would never divorce him, and that he had wanted his wife out of the way so he could pursue his relationship with a lady by the name of Lorraine Stiles. Lorraine and David had met when she was a caregiver for his mother back in 1967, and the pair had had an on-off relationship for more than 14 years. The prosecution claimed that Brenda had been aware of her husband's infidelity, and in 1970 Brenda had confronted Lorraine and informed her that David also had other lovers. The affair had continued during the time of Brenda's disappearance and the subsequent search, but eventually fizzled out late in 1982. Lorraine died in 2017, but a statement which she gave to the police in 1984 described David as quite composed about his wife going missing. During the police interviews, David had downplayed the significance of this affair, stating that it was just a short-term fling. David then went on to say that Fred West could have been responsible for Brenda's disappearance. He said, "A lady rang me up. I vaguely knew her. She said Fred West picked her up in Worcester at a bus stop early one morning, but luckily she managed to escape. I always wondered since then whether he was responsible for picking Brenda up and eventually disposing of her body." When the police asked more about the lady, David could not recall her name. The prosecution also detailed how Brenda had seen a consultant psychiatrist, Dr. Richards, in February 1982, whose notes indicated that she was deeply unhappy in her loveless and sexless marriage. On the other hand, David's defence team argued that it would have been an act of folly for him to place his wife's body in the septic tank at his own house. They also stated that Brenda may have taken her own life without leaving a note. When David took the witness stand, he denied the prosecution's accusations and claimed that he had always adored his wife. He maintained his innocence, suggesting that her remains may have been put in the septic tank shortly before they were discovered. The Crown Prosecution Service refuted the idea that someone removed Brenda Venables' remains from where they had been hidden for years in order to put them in the septic tank outside her home in the days before they were found. They also said that it was inconceivable that Brenda went voluntarily into the septic tank and somehow shifted the heavy lid and put it back in place above her so that there was no signs of any disturbance there. There were also no known records of suicide involving sewage, septic tanks or cesspits. After 5 weeks of trial, the jury took around 17 hours, spread over 4 days, to reach their verdict. With a 10-2 majority, David was found guilty of 1 count of murder on the 15th of July 2022. He showed no emotion as the verdict was read out. High Court Judge Mrs. Justice Cilliers stated that he had shown no remorse for his crime and that he was responsible for many aspects of Brenda's deteriorating mental health prior to her death. During sentencing, Mrs. Justice Cilliers stated that, "I'm sure you killed Brenda Venables to remove her from your life and the complications she may have presented to you in any divorce proceedings," adding that he had taken advantage of his wife's depression to create a carefully thought out story that she had left him in the middle of the night to take her own life. His lies led to a police search that cost thousands of pounds and wasted many hours of police time. She also stated that, "Your complete lack of respect for Brenda is obvious from your decision to dispose of her body in the septic tank. The fact that is what you did with her body is disgusting and repulsive." Now aged 89, David was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 18 years. Due to his advanced age, it is very likely that he will only serve a fraction of his sentence and will never walk free again. That concludes today's story. Please add any comments down below, and thanks very much for listening to the Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst. As today's case was from Worcestershire, I had to mention Worcester sauce. It was invented by 2 chemists back in 1837, Mr. Lee and Mr. Perrins. Have you tried it? Goodbye. Hello, and welcome back to the Crime Reel. For today's true crime narration, we shall be looking at the lives of Tanya van Cuylenborg and J. Roland Cook from Canada. Tanya was born in 1969 in Victoria, British Columbia. She lived with her parents William and Jean and her brother John, along with their golden retriever Tessa. She had a happy childhood and enjoyed sailing and playing guitar. Jay, who was 2 years older than Tanya, was born on the 16th of December 1966. He had 2 sisters, Laura Lee and Kelly, and lived with them and his parents, Leona and Gordon. They lived in Saanich, British Columbia. Like Tanya, he also loved to go sailing and worked on a fishing boat, as well as in a local pizza restaurant at weekends. Tanya and Jay both attended Oak Bay High School and began dating around May 1987. That summer, Tanya graduated and was taking some time out to decide upon her career path. The young couple seemed very happy together and were well liked by each other's families. On 18th of November 1987, Jay and Tanya set off on an overnight road trip to Seattle. They had borrowed Jay's father's 1977 Ford Club van and were headed to the city to collect a large parcel for Jay's father's business. Leaving Saanich, they drove south to Victoria, where they boarded the MV Coho ferry to Port Angeles, Washington. They then headed southeast on the 101, heading towards Bremerton, where they planned to take another ferry to Seattle. The obvious route to take would be to leave the 101 and take the 104 to Bremerton. However, the young couple made 2 purchases, one in Hoodsport and the other in Alley, both of which were further south on the 101, so it is likely that they either missed the 104 exit or decided to take a longer route. Sometime after 10 that evening, they purchased their ferry tickets for the 10:35 p.m. ferry to Seattle. They boarded the ferry with the plan to find a place to park up and spend the night in the van once arriving at the docks. They would then make the collection in Seattle the following morning before travelling back to Saanich. They were due to return home the following evening but didn't arrive. This was completely out of character for Tanya and Jay, who would always call if they were going to be late. Their parents started to worry, but tried to convince themselves that perhaps the van had broken down and the couple were unable to get to a phone. However, when no contact had been made by the following morning, panic set in and Tanya and Jay were reported missing. Both families were beside themselves with worry. Their children had simply disappeared. A huge search operation was soon underway. The families even hired a plane to fly over the area where Tanya and Jay had disappeared in the hope of spotting the van. On 24th of November 1987, Tanya's family received the devastating news that her partially clothed body had been found in a ditch about an hour north of Seattle. Tanya had been restrained with plastic ties, sexually assaulted and shot in the back of the head. Suspicion immediately fell onto Jay, with investigators pursuing the theory that he was responsible for Tanya's death. Neither of the families believed this to be the case. Tanya and Jay were happy, in love, and their relationship had never shown any hints of trouble or violence. The following day, 25th of November 1987, the van was found near a Greyhound bus station in Bellingham, Washington. Inside, police found a partial palm print, plastic ties identical to the ones used to restrain Tanya, plastic gloves, ammunition, and Tanya's trousers, which were found to have semen on them. Nearby, police found Tanya's keys and purse. Just hours later, on the 26th of November 1987, some hunters came across Jay's body. It was near the Snoqualmie River, around 60 miles from where Tanya had been found. Jay had been beaten and strangled to death. Investigators now began working on the theory that Jay and Tanya had offered their attacker a lift. Jay's mum, Leona, said that her son was the sort of young man who was always ready to help anyone and would definitely pick up a stranger if they appeared to be in need. The police believed that the young couple had most likely met their killer on the second ferry journey. Due to the brutality of the murders, it was assumed that the killer would have a criminal past, and police were hopeful that the DNA evidence found would enable them to identify the killer. Surprisingly, there was no DNA match. On December 5th, 1987, a memorial service was held in University of Victoria's Interfaith Chapel. Meanwhile, the police continued to pursue all leads, but were constantly confronted with dead ends. During the Christmas holidays that year, both Jay and Tanya's families started to receive greeting cards through the post. The cards made reference to the murders and were written to cause maximum upset to the families. They were all sent from the same person, with postmarks from either New York, Los Angeles, or Seattle. The police tried to locate who had sent these cards, but again faced a series of dead ends. The cards continued to arrive sporadically for around a year and then suddenly stopped. Despite the best efforts of those involved, the case went cold. In 1997, Tanya's father, Bill, passed away without ever seeing the person responsible for his daughter's murder brought to justice. He was 61 years old. It wasn't for another 23 years, in 2010, that it seemed there would finally be a break in this case. The man who had sent the cards was identified. This man was a 78-year-old transient who had been diagnosed with several mental health issues. Upon further investigation, it was soon determined that he had nothing to do with the actual crimes. He admitted to investigators that he had been in a very dark place when he sent the cards and apologised for the distress that he had caused. Due to the statute of limitations, the man was not charged. The investigation had once again stalled. In 2018, images were released by police showing how the perpetrator may look. These images were created using specialty DNA technology known as DNA phenotyping. This method determines how a person might look from a sample of their DNA. 3 images were released of the murderer at ages 25, 45 and 65. Despite receiving over 100 new leads, the police were still no closer to catching the killer. A different approach was needed. The DNA found at the crime scene was compared to a public genealogy website. The results came back that the DNA was linked to 2 people on the site. From the level of matches, a genealogist determined that these people were likely to be second cousins on different sides of a family tree. When this was investigated further, it was determined that the crime scene DNA most likely belonged to a male son of William and Patricia Talbot. William and Patricia had 3 daughters and 1 son. William Earl Talbot II, a quiet 55-year-old truck driver from Washington State. At the time of the murders, William would have been 24 years old and living with his parents approximately 6 miles from where Jay's body had been found. William had been arrested for assault in 1984, 3 years before the double murder. He had completed anger management counselling for this and had not been arrested or charged with any crime since. In addition, his family have more recently described multiple incidents where he was extremely violent to them during his youth. However, the police needed conclusive proof to determine that William was definitely the killer. In order to get this, they needed a sample of William's DNA. The police began to follow William, and when a coffee cup fell out of his truck, the police quickly retrieved it and tested the DNA. It matched that found at the crime scene, and in May 2018, over 30 years after the crime, William was arrested and charged with the murders of Tanya and Jay. Bail was set for $2.5 million. The trial began on the 11th of June 2019. William pleaded not guilty to the charges. He did not testify at his trial. The prosecution showed that the palm print in the minivan belonged to William, and the DNA matched not only the semen found at the scene, but also on the plastic ties used to restrain Tanya. On 28th of June 2019, William was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. A month later, still protesting his innocence, William was given 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole. He is currently serving his sentence in Washington State Penitentiary and plans to appeal his conviction. The case took more than 30 years to solve, but Jay and Tanya's killer would finally start to pay for his crimes. The trial became the first in history where a person was successfully convicted after being linked to a crime via a genetic genealogy database. This method of policing has not been without controversy. The technology can be accessed without a warrant and used to identify people based on the participation of distant relatives in public databases. Some view this as an invasion of privacy. Whether you view this as an essential policing tool or a gross invasion of privacy is a matter of opinion. However, it is clear that its use in this specific case has enabled two grieving families to receive at least some level of much needed closure. That concludes today's story. Thanks very much for listening to that. Please leave any comments down below. As always, I'll be interested in reading them. Thanks very much for listening to The Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. For today's true crime narration, we shall be looking at the recent events relating to the 1984 murder of Christine Jessop and how developments in the science of DNA and genetic genealogy testing have led to her killer being identified 36 years after the crime. In 1984, Christine Jessop was 9 years old and was living with her mother, Janet, and her older brother, 14-year-old Kenny. They lived in the quiet rural community of Queensville, Ontario, in Canada. She was described as a happy-go-lucky young girl who loved animals and sports. At that time, Christine's father, Robert, was being held in custody at a detention centre after he had been charged with misappropriation of company funds. Very few people knew of the family's legal troubles, and on 3rd of October 1984, Janet and Kenny were making a trip to the detention centre to visit Robert. As Christine was only 9 years old at the time, Janet felt that she was too young to go on the visit with them. Christine attended school, then returned home on the bus as normal that day. After getting off of the bus, she went into the nearby convenience store to buy some bubble gum before heading home to the empty house. Christine had arranged to meet her friend Leslie at the playground at 4 p.m. that evening, but she never arrived. When Janet and Kenny returned home from their visit, they were surprised to find Christine's bike carelessly abandoned by their front door. This was very out of character for Christine, who loved her bike and took very good care of it. Her coat was hanging on a hook, which was out of Christine's reach, and Christine was nowhere to be found. After realising that Christine was not in the house, Janet contacted friends and neighbours in an attempt to find out where her daughter was. The police were notified at around 7 p.m. that evening, and an investigation into the disappearance was soon underway, led by the York Regional Police. It would be almost 3 months later, on 31st of December 1984, that Christine's family received the devastating news that Christine's body had been found by a man out walking with his 2 young daughters. The partially decomposed body, which had to be identified by dental records, had been found in a rural area approximately 35 miles away from the family's home. Christine had been brutally beaten and sexually assaulted. The cause of death was established as stab wounds to the chest. The following day, the investigation was taken over by the Durham Police Department. Christine was buried on the 7th of January 1985, at which point the police were investigating numerous leads, but were yet to identify a strong suspect in Christine's murder. However, in mid-February 1985, the police became interested in a man by the name of Guy Paul Moran. Guy lived with his parents next door to the Jessop family, with some reports stating that they were quite a strange family, with Guy being described as odd. The police became convinced that Guy was the one responsible for Christine's death, and the investigation continued on the basis of proving Guy's guilt. On 22nd of April 1985, Guy was arrested and charged with Christine's murder. He protested his innocence, and exactly a year after Christine was laid to rest, the trial began. It lasted approximately 4 weeks, during which time many inconsistencies and inaccuracies in the Crown's case were highlighted by Guy's defence team. The timeline between Guy's day and when Janet and Kenny discovered Christine was missing did not add up. There simply wasn't enough time for Guy to have committed the murder. A witness who had heard screams in the vicinity of the area where Christine was found was ignored, despite this corroborating Guy's timeline. Key evidence had gone missing and procedures were not followed. A hair found at the crime scene was similar to Guy's and provided no conclusive evidence, and fibres found could easily be explained by the proximity of the two families' homes. The prosecution presented two witnesses who both claimed to have heard Guy confessing to the crime whilst in prison. These two men both received some form of deal in exchange for their testimony. On February the 7th, 1986, after the jury had deliberated for around 13 hours, Guy was found not guilty of Christine's murder. However, Guy's ordeal was far from over. The Crown exercised its right to appeal the verdict. The appeal was made on the grounds that the trial judge had made a fundamental error in the instructions given to the jury. The Ontario Court of Appeal ordered a new trial. Guy appealed against this, but the decision was upheld. 4 years after Guy's acquittal, the new trial began on 28th of May 1990. Christine's body was exhumed, and it was found that key details were missing during the first autopsy. It was also established that small bones found by Kenny during a visit to the site where Christine had been found definitely belonged to Christine and had been missed at the time of the original search of the area. The second trial lasted far longer. However, the cases put forward by both the prosecution and defence were fundamentally the same as the first trial. The two inmates who claimed to have witnessed Guy's confession were given more credibility at the second trial, as it was made clear that they had, this time, agreed to testify voluntarily rather than as part of a deal from which they would benefit. In addition, during this trial, it came to light that Christine's brother Kenny, along with two other boys, had been having sex with each other and with Christine from when she was 5 years old until her death. This would have taken place when Kenny was between 10 and 14 years old, and he has stated that he was also a victim of abuse at the hands of the two other boys, one of whom was much older at the time. Due to this information, Kenny did become a suspect at one point of the investigation, but was cleared of any involvement. At the end of July 1992, the trial came to a close. A unanimous verdict of guilty of first-degree murder was read out to the shock of many of those involved. Guy was sentenced to life in prison. Unlike others convicted of sexually assaulting and murdering children, Guy was kept in the general population at Kingston Penitentiary during his time in prison. Guy appealed his conviction and, in an unusual move, was released on bond on the 10th of February 1993 whilst awaiting the outcome of this appeal. Less than 2 years later, in January 1995, as the new trial date was approaching, changes to the DNA techniques used were able to conclusively rule out Guy's involvement in the crime. After 10 years of living in limbo, Guy could finally move on with his life. The problems with this case and conviction led to significant changes of how police investigated murders in Canada. It was by now 10 years since Christine's murder, and it was once again an unsolved case. In February 1995, the investigation was transferred to the Toronto Police Department, where it would take another 25 years for them to reach any kind of closure. On 15th of October 2020, the police named the man responsible for Christine's death, following an investigation which had lasted over 35 years. It was announced that investigators had contacted a genetic laboratory in Texas. This laboratory works exclusively with law enforcement to help to provide leads and identify subjects through DNA. A technique known as genetic genealogy was used. This is where a possible family tree can be constructed from a DNA sample. This technique does not come up with an individual suspect, but gives a potential family lineage which can be used to point investigators in a certain direction, enabling them to then use traditional techniques to ascertain someone's innocence or guilt. By using a semen sample found at the scene of the crime, the police were able to identify a strong suspect, a man by the name of Calvin Hoover. Calvin had been 28 at the time of Christine's murder. He was married to a lady named Heather, who worked with Christine's father, Robert. The two families were known to have socialised together, and Heather was one of the few people who was aware of Robert's legal troubles. Heather, and therefore possibly Calvin, were aware that Janet and Kenny would be visiting Robert that day and that Christine would be alone. After Christine's disappearance, Calvin joined a search to try to find her. Together with his wife, they attended Christine's funeral and the wake. Calvin took his own life in 2015. Blood from the autopsy was compared to the DNA found at the crime scene and was found to be a match. If Calvin was still alive today, he would be charged with Christine's murder. Calvin had a completely unrelated criminal history at the time of Christine's murder and was not connected to any other crimes before his death in 2015. However, it would lead us to question whether someone who had committed such a violent and brutal murder could possibly have done so as a one-off event. Guy has a surprising lack of bitterness towards the legal system which failed him. His family had to mortgage their house and spent all of their money to provide him with the best possible legal representation. A public inquiry was ordered in June 1998, and 7 months later he was awarded compensation of $1.25 million Canadian dollars. When he was told of the killer finally being identified, he said, "I am grateful that the Toronto police stayed on the case and have now finally solved it. When DNA exonerated me in January 1995, I was sure that one day DNA would reveal the real killer, and now it has." For the Jessop family, they will finally have some closure knowing who had taken the life of Christine, but will now have to deal with the frustration of never seeing that person brought to justice. That concludes today's story. Thanks very much to Amy's Watching the Stars and Marion Bowler, who told me about this old case that finally had some closure. Please add any comments down below. Thanks very much for listening to The Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. For today's true crime narration, we shall be going to Africa, the second largest of the world's 7 continents. Home to 54 countries, we shall be visiting the 6th most populated of these, South Africa. Stellenbosch is one of the best known towns in South Africa, becoming one of its leading tourist destinations due to its history, culture, vineries, and natural beauty. However, in May 2007, it was the scene of a brutal crime, the perpetrator of which was not brought to justice for over a decade. 31-year-old Felicity Cilliers was a seasonal farm worker at Longlands Farm in Stellenbosch. She had 3 young sons aged 13, 9 and 14 months old. She was well known and well liked within her local community. She was softly spoken, friendly and kind. Felicity had 2 siblings, a sister, Daleen, and a brother, Denzel. On 26th of May 2007, a local person was having a 21st birthday party. Lots of people had been invited and it was set to be a large, fun night out. Felicity decided to attend, but her sister Daleen had opted for a night in with her boyfriend instead. As Felicity left to go to the party that evening, it would be the last time that her sister would ever see her alive. Felicity never returned home that night, and 4 days later, the family received the heartbreaking news that Felicity's body had been found in the vineyards on a farm in the Vlottenberg area of Stellenbosch. Felicity had suffered an extremely violent death. She had been brutally sexually assaulted, strangled, and had sustained massive head injuries. A police investigation followed. 2 men were arrested but released after it was found that they were not a DNA match. Eventually, all leads dried up, and within months the case had gone cold. Felicity's death, along with the additional trauma of knowing that someone had got away with her murder, took a tremendous toll on her family. Within months of her murder, Felicity's previously healthy 14-month-old son died from complications related to gastroenteritis. Felicity's family believed that he had died from the grief of losing his mother. Felicity's father's health deteriorated over the years as he struggled to come to terms with losing his beloved daughter and the violent nature of her death. Her 2 older sons, just 13 and 9 at the time of her murder, started to struggle in school and eventually dropped out completely. Finding it impossible to deal with the events of their mother's death, they never really spoke about their feelings. Over time, they have both become addicted to drugs. It wasn't until many years later, in 2018, that the family were finally able to achieve some closure. Sergeant Kelvin Moses had taken over responsibility for investigating the case in 2016. This was 9 years after the murder took place. He was determined to do his utmost to find some answers for a family who had suffered so much. It was a conversation between the sergeant and Felicity's father, Johannes, that ultimately led to the break which they had all been searching for. Johannes told him that another woman had been found about a month after his daughter. She had been murdered in the same way. Due to the fact that Sergeant Moses had only joined the team several years after the murder, he had no knowledge that there had been a second crime. He asked Johannes if anyone had been charged with that murder, and he replied that a local man, Andrew Jordan, had been imprisoned for the crime. In 2007, Andrew had been living in the same area as Felicity and was friends with both Felicity's sister, Daylene, and Daylene's boyfriend. The whole family knew of Andrew and generally regarded him as a friendly and trustworthy person. Andrew was arrested in late 2007, shortly after the second murder took place. The family was shocked at his arrest. Andrew pleaded guilty to the murder charge and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. In spite of the fact that there were striking similarities between this murder and Felicity's death, the family believed that he was not responsible for Felicity's murder. Despite extensive research, I've been unable to find why they believed in his innocence. Most reports either do not mention this or state that the family did not believe he was involved, as he didn't really know Felicity. After serving just 6 years of his sentence, Andrew had been released on parole in 2013. Sergeant Moses and his colleague Sergeant Roger Euster compared Andrew's DNA to that which had been found on Felicity after she had been murdered. It was found that the semen present at the scene of the crime belonged to Andrew. In July 2018, the sergeants tracked down Andrew, who was now living in Zoar near Ladysmith. When interviewed, he was asked if he had ever had sex with Felicity. He stated that he had not. With the DNA evidence proving that Andrew was lying, Sergeant Moses had sufficient grounds to make an arrest. The case went to trial in the spring of 2019. Andrew pleaded not guilty. Simply the presence of his DNA would not automatically prove his guilt. It was still necessary to prove this beyond a reasonable doubt. When Andrew was confronted with the DNA evidence by the prosecution team, he changed his story and said that he had had consensual sex with Felicity. This version of events was not believed by the court, particularly due to the level of violence Felicity had experienced during the sexual assault. Prosecutors suggested that Andrew had managed to lure Felicity away from the party to a secluded area of the farm, showing that there had been a level of pre-planning involved. He then sexually assaulted her, strangled her, and beat her around the head with a rock. Felicity's father, Johannes, who stated that he would never rest until the person responsible for his daughter's death was punished. He attended the trial every day, looking much older than his 65 years. Also present were Felicity's brother and sister, Denzel and Daylene. At the Western Cape High Court on May 19, 2019, Andrew was found guilty. Throughout the trial, Andrew did not show any remorse for Felicity's murder and never apologised to Felicity's family. The sentencing proceedings were scheduled for October that year in order for Andrew to receive treatment for his severe depression and suicidal tendencies. On 24th of October 2019, Andrew appeared in court to find out his sentence. He did not testify at these sentencing proceedings and provided no additional information as to what had happened on the night of 26th of May 2007. His defence team requested that the court took into account the fact that Andrew had been both neglected and abused as a child, stating that he was an example of the problem when the cycle of child abuse was not addressed and the victims grew into adults. The court was also advised that Andrew was still suffering from severe depression and had attempted suicide twice in recent times. His legal team argued that Andrew was under the influence of alcohol when the crime was committed, and it was this that had driven him to such violence. They also pointed out that he had not been involved in any further crimes since his release on parole in 2013. Noting that Andrew had a propensity for violence against women and had shown no remorse for his crime, Judge Lister Nuku sentenced 35-year-old Andrew to life in prison for Felicity's murder, plus an additional 10 years for the sexual assault. After the sentencing was completed, an extremely relieved Johannes, flanked by his remaining daughter and son, were photographed outside the court. They said that they were happy with the sentence and relieved that their ordeal was finally over. They would now try to move on and remember Felicity for the soft and kind person that she was. For the Cilliers family, it has been an extremely long and emotional journey, lasting over 11 years before Felicity's killer was finally brought to justice. The family believe that their healing can now begin. That concludes the story of Felicity Cilliers. Thanks very much for listening. As usual, if you have any comments, please add them down below. Thanks very much for listening to The Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Just wanted to say thanks to Sergeant Kelvin Moses and his team for solving this case eventually. Great job. Rest in peace, Felicity. Goodbye.